Good morning and welcome to day 2 of the U.S. Space Command Legal Conference presented to you by the U.S. Air Force Academy's Law, Technology, and Warfare Research Cell, together with the U.S. Space Command Office of the Staff Judge Advocate. Once again, my name is Professor Jeff Biller, and along with Lieutenant Colonel Tim Goins, Lieutenant Commander Mark Rasmussen, and Major Jeremy Grunet, we are your conference hosts. If you have any questions or concerns during the conference or after, please contact us through the chat or via our email, ltwrc@usafa.edu. As a reminder, if you have any concerns or issues to relate to us as your conference hosts, please use the chat function. If you have questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A. Finally, another reminder that all opinions and thoughts expressed as part of this conference should be considered the personal opinions of the speakers unless otherwise indicated. Now we have a very full schedule of speakers today, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Lieutenant Commander Rasmussen to introduce our second conference keynote presentation. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning again, everyone. I think it is going to be another great day of speakers and panelists. As Jeff noted, my name is Lieutenant Commander Mark Rasmussen. I'm a national security law attorney here at Space Command. And it is my distinct pleasure this morning to introduce our distinguished speakers for our first keynote, members of the National Security Council. For those of you that are unfamiliar, the NSC is the President's principal forum for national security and foreign policy decision-making with his senior national security advisors and cabinet officials. And it's the President's principal arm for coordinating these policies across federal agencies. With us today are Brigadier General Troy Endicott and Captain Robert Pascarello. General Endicott serves as the Director for Space Policy, National Security Council, Executive Office of the President in Washington, D.C. He's had a distinguished career since graduating from Embry-Riddle University in 1994. Prior to his current assignment, General Endicott commanded the 460th Space Wing and was the installation commander at Buckley Air Force Base here in Colorado. Captain Pascarello serves as the Deputy Legal Advisor to the NSC. He began his distinguished career as a Marine Corps infantryman, Semper Fi, and has served as a Navy Judge Advocate since 1997. Prior to his current assignment, Captain Pascarello served as Commanding Officer, Region Legal Service Office, Naval District, Washington, and as Executive Assistant and Special Counsel to the General Counsel for the Department of the Navy. He also served as the Operational Law Chief and Deputy Staff Judge Advocate at U.S. Central Command. Sirs, we greatly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules today and sharing your perspectives with us. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everybody. Congratulations on what appears to be a successful first U.S. Space Command Legal Conference. This is exciting to see folks jump online, and I looked at your agenda, and we think it's a very rich agenda, so it's an honor to be part of your agenda and be able to talk to you a little bit today. As Mark said, I'm Brigadier General Troy Endicott, and I've been detailed to the National Security Council staff since May of 2019. But before I begin, it is prudent to make an obligatory legal statement, which I imagine would not be lost on anyone in this crowd. So let me hand it over briefly to my shipmate here, Robert Pascarello, for the legal comment.
Thank you, sir. So kind of as a quick disclaimer up front, because we do work at the White House, I want to make sure that folks understand that what we'll discuss today does not reflect the official views of the NSC or the White House. I spend some time usually advising folks on executive privilege. So, as part of the NSC, we're not really allowed to discuss anything that's pre-decisional or deliberative. So just have that in mind. So these are our personal reflections, and we'll look forward to sharing them with you. Thank you.
And so that's exactly what this is going to be about, is our personal reflections. I'm getting a little sentimental as I'm coming towards the end of a 2-year tour here in the National Security Council staff. And I will tell you that in the last 2 years, I think a few things have happened in the space environment. In fact, even 2 years ago, before I started, we wouldn't be even having anything like a U.S. Space Command legal conference. And so as we look back in the last 2 years, it's in a historical time where so many things have happened in space, and many things have happened because of what you all have done and the work that you do and continue to do. So just tell you a little bit more about my position. So as Mark said, the National Security Council was created and is the President's principal forum for consideration of national security policy issues requiring the President's determination. It was started in 1947. It was stood up by the National Security Act of 1947 and created, that same act created things like the United States Air Force and also the CIA. But what's interesting, and something that we learned firsthand, is every president will modify and tailor a National Security Council staff and National Security Council team to meet the needs and priorities of the president. Being here for 2 years, I've been able to work for multiple senior directors in the National Security Council staff, 3 national security advisors, and 2 presidential administrations. And it's been absolutely fascinating to be an advisor and policy maker on space for all of those teams. The membership of the National Security Council under this administration is comprised and captured in February 4th's National Security Memorandum, NSM-2. So hopefully you had a chance to review that, but it's titled Renewing the National Security Council System. So within the National Security Council staff, there are multiple directorates, both regional and functional. And I'm part of the Defense Directorate, which is a functional directorate obviously focused on defense matters. But I'm the Director for Space Policy, which has been a classic position in the Defense Directorate that goes back to the Reagan administration, I'm told. Previous directors, many of you have worked with: Peter Marquez, Jacques Parikh, General Bill LaCourie, General Michelle Edmondson, and I follow that long line of great, super smart space policymakers. But we work hand in hand with the legal directorate, and I want to hand the mic over to my colleague, trusted legal advisor again, Captain Pascarello, who will tell you more about what he does in the legal directorate.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. So good morning again, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of my experiences here at the NSC. My opening comments have a little bit less to do with space law and a bit more about just practicing as an attorney here at the NSC. For those of you who might be interested in joining the team sometime down in the future. So I arrived here in August of 2020, about 9 months ago. So I worked here in the last 6 months of the 45 administration, and I worked for the first 2.5 months of the Biden administration. And I've been asked by other attorneys and JAGs, what prepared me best to work as an attorney at the NSC. And I say certainly my joint experience and some time at the Pentagon did help, but I'll be candid and say that really there's nothing that could have prepared me for many of the issues, the type and volume of work that we did. It's a little bit of a different environment in that I would say that 90% of the issues that we see are really true national security issues. 10% of them do kind of veer into the political realm sometimes, and at least in the legal side, those questions, when they do come up, I defer those to the political appointed attorneys that work within the NSC. So just as an example of a portfolio, right now I support 6 directorates, 2 functional and 4 geographic. One of my main clients is a defense strategy directorate, and within that I get to do space, which truly is one of my favorite portfolios. About 3 months ago, I took on the cyber directorate, which has grown significantly in scope of responsibilities. For those of you who also may work in the cyber realm, we have a new Deputy National Security Advisor for cyberspace, and there are 3 directorates under that, one for cyber offense, one for cyber defense, and one for emerging technology. And then I support South Asia, which includes Afghanistan. We're fairly busy. Pound Russia, obviously we're fairly busy, including in the space realm, as we'll talk about in a bit. And I also cover Africa and Western hemispheres. So we're a bit busy. In terms of what my day is like, it can range, I would say on average, about 4 meetings, all the way up to 7 or 8 sometimes, given what's happening. At least 2 or 3 of those are what we call IPCs, Interagency Policy Committees, which generally are referenced under NSM-2. So usually I have sub-IPCs, IPCs, deputy committees, and principal committees, and they kind of move up in seniority as we get closer to making a presidential decision. One thing I found interesting is that legal clears everything here. We review for clarity of expression, for legal issues, policy issues sometimes, everything from summary of conclusions of interagency meetings to talking points for either the president or the national security advisor with foreign leaders. That particular point I find a bit humbling to have an opportunity to review, some statements that are going to be made by the president or the national security advisor. We also look at White House proclamations. It can be anything from a statement on a significant policy issue to something more social, like discussing Hispanic Heritage Month or Thanksgiving. We also review, obviously, NSMs. So some of you, if you track, each administration has a different term for what they call the documents one level below the executive orders. So in the Trump administration, it was NSPMs, National Security Presidential Memorandums. Under Obama, there were PPDs, Presidential Policy Directives, and now they're NSMs, National Security Memorandums. And then we work pretty closely with OMB and OLC on getting executive orders through. As most of you probably tracked, in the first couple of weeks, there were dozens that were signed. The pace has kind of slowed down a little bit in that realm, but there's still a lot that's happening. One of our major roles, I would say, generally speaking, is to kind of build legal consensus. Many times it's not necessary, but there's often times where departments and agencies do not see eye to eye on either a legal interpretation or a way forward on a particular issue. I have 3 issues on my plate right now where we're trying to reach consensus, and hopefully, in the near future, we will. If I can't reach consensus kind of at my level, then it gets bumped up to my boss, and he'll actually meet with the general counsels of the different agencies to see if we can come to a consensus. I've learned in doing that work that it's really important to not take anything personal, to try to make others see the other colleagues' side, and then to start rowing in the same direction. And I'll close with just a couple of anecdotes of some memorable experiences. I was actually in this room probably about 5 or 6 months ago when the president of Serbia, president of Kosovo were in here discussing the Washington commitments, which made the news, and were pretty groundbreaking. That was a pretty humbling experience. And then most recently with General Endicott, got to sit in on some senior level discussions with the Russians about space. So again, the work is interesting. It's hard. The hours are not short, but if you have an opportunity to raise your hand and come into work at the NSC, please do. And if any of you have any questions offline, please feel free to reach out to me separately. And with that, I will hand it back to General Endicott.
Thank you, Robert. As you can see, legal advice and legal professional perspective is key to our success here in the National Security Council staff. And Robert, thank you for that. There's probably not a day that doesn't go by that we don't talk at least 300 or 400 or 500 times. And so it's absolutely busy, but it's a partnership. So when we think about space, think about what has been going on in space for the last couple of years as I've been sitting in this seat working with folks like Robert on really big space efforts. I'd like to maybe have you think about where you fit in the broader space enterprise, and then look beyond that vantage point. From this vantage point, it's pretty clear. When you think about our nation's influence in space, I like to think of it as bend into 3 major lines of effort for our country. And it's a civil space line of effort, commercial and industry space line of effort, and national security space line of effort. And then if you look back at the policies that have been coming out of the White House and the statements that continue to come out of the White House, even just recently, you can think of that we're addressing those 3 major lines of effort. So just give you a little bit of a history lesson, many of you are aware, but also just remind you of the policies that are still in place. So for example, in the last administration, it was a national policy to reinvigorate our human space exploration program. And as you all, many of you know, we renewed the National Space Council. President Biden and our administration has also said that we're committed to continuing the renewing the National Space Council with priorities for this administration. So there is momentum also in place. But if you recall, one of the first policy documents, SPD1, came out of the last administration, reinvigorating America's human space exploration program. I got to tell you, since then, it's absolutely crazy, incredibly exciting on what's happening in the civil space world. It's absolutely fascinating how our nation is what it's accomplishing in the civil space environment and what it continues to accomplish in the civil space environment. Right now, we're talking at a time where we have our nation's 5th rover on Mars. And we're getting ready to launch a helicopter off of that rover, which is just fascinating, but exploring Mars and then looking future to the near future, going back to the moon with the Artemis program. Hey, it's amazing how much momentum that we've built in the civil space world. And as we look forward to going back to the moon and then going from the moon back to Mars. And so many of you are aware of this, but I'll tell you, it's still a priority. It's a priority of this administration. We continue with this great momentum, and for many reasons, right? Many policy reasons, but also just many reasons, national security reasons, technical reasons, and national pride, for example. Then you look at policies that were put in place to reinvigorate our space commercial base as well. And if you follow some of the early policies, SPD2, streamlining regulations on commercial use of space, was one of the policies to enable the commercial side of space in that line of effort. We spent a lot of time discussing the right policies to put in place to enable and to give America a competitive advantage and edge, of course, on the commercial market. We also look at space, and the sustainability of space is important. SPD3, National Space Traffic Management Policy, came after SPD2. And so as we have increased activity in space, obviously the sustainability and safety of space activities are very important as well. And then what most of you or many of you are concerned about are the national security line of effort for space and our nation's efforts in national security space. Many of you are tracking, of course, SPD4 that established the U.S. Space Force. It was, and of course, before the U.S. Space Force, establishing and reestablishing U.S. Space Command. It's exciting personally to be in the South Lawn in the Rose Garden at the ceremony reestablishing U.S. Space Command. It's a proud moment for me, and it's a proud moment for all of you, I'm quite sure. And then just a couple months later, establishing our 6th branch of the Armed Forces, the United States Space Force, which just shows you the seriousness that we're taking when we look at space as a potential domain of conflict, but also securing that domain, and how critical and important it is at this time, and how all those other things that I've described are equally important and worth defending and protecting. So when you go forward and look at the policies that we've put in place in this administration, we reaffirm the commitment to the major themes of those lines of efforts. If you follow in the most recent statements that have been captured in the interim National Security Strategic Guidance of March 2021, we say, the President has said, we will explore and use outer space to the benefit of humanity and ensure the safety, stability, and security of outer space activities. It also says in that same document, we will lead in promoting shared norms and forge new agreements on emerging technologies, space, cyberspace, health and biological threats, climate, environment, and human rights. I think you have a piece and a role in this when it comes to deterring irresponsible behavior in space. This is really a key priority in U.S. Space Command. Look at the U.S. Space Command mission is to conduct operations in, from, and to space to deter conflict, and if necessary, defeat aggression, deliver space combat power for the joint combined force, and defend U.S. vital interests with allies and partners. I think that's a very good mission statement. And then when you follow that line of thinking and starting with deterring conflict, I'd like to remind many of you who work this every day, the National Security Space Guidelines that were published just recently in the National Space Policy. And maybe it helps give you a framework on thinking about national security space and deterring conflict. If you recall, and if many of you have read that policy, that starts with robust space domain awareness. This is something that U.S. Space Command is doing. It leads the world in robust space domain awareness. But you do it for safety of flight, but also to characterize and attribute potentially threatening behavior. Also, one of the major activities and efforts as we go forward that we seek your help and support in is communicating to competitors which space activities the United States considers undesirable or irresponsible, while promoting, demonstrating, and communicating responsible norms of behavior. You hear a lot about responsible norms of behavior, and again, we even asserted the need for shared norms in the space environment in the interim national security strategic guidance. I know this is a lot of work that you all are working through, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. As we go down the line to deter irresponsible behavior, assured, credible, and demonstrable responses to defend vital national interests in space are also critical. I know many of you are working these problems as well. What do we say? What do we do? What do we show? How do we have credible responses, and how do we have deterrence framework to message what those potential responses are? And then we need resilient space-enabled missions that reduce the impact or deny the effectiveness of adversary actions, at least from a national security perspective. This is where we are looking at our national security space architectures, and many of you have a role in this as well on reframing and refocusing what our systems will do, what they can do in a domain of conflict, in a domain that is considered a warfighting domain. So these are very important. Now I want to just go back to the norms of behavior. This is a key focus item for many of you and us as well. When we look at the space environment, national security space environment, and whether it's for commercial space, civil space, and national security space, right? The space domain in itself, establishing norms of behavior are absolutely important, especially for this century as we see space activity grow. We have some great examples of norms of behavior work, especially on the UN front. The peaceful uses of outer space, UN COPIUS, long-term sustainability guidelines are great examples. In the civil space front, what recently has come out of NASA with the Artemis Accords with 9 signatories shows you that peaceful norms in civil space activities are can be had and certainly can be signed up to by our allies and partners and those who support us on our civil and commercial space enterprises. So when we think about national security space, what does that look like? What kind of norms do we need to put in place? And I know U.S. Space Command and your legal teams and many of the legal experts on this net are working through. I think we have a short window to establish some initial rules and norms for peacetime activities, national security activities in peacetime. There are some challenges, right? What aggression? How do we define aggression in space? How do we define irresponsible behavior? How do we show responsible behavior? I think we have an idea, but how do we write that down? How do we capture that? What activities are we trying to deter? You know, you think of just basic things that we understand pretty well in other domains, but do you look at them differently in the space domain? What is a hostile act? How do we determine hostile intent? Even harder, right? Do we have the authorities in place at all levels to act in appropriate timelines? These are efforts that all of us at all levels need to be wrestling with and truly coming up with new ideas to address. Are there examples in other domains which we can pull from? You know, I think of the maritime domain, and I get a lot of questions being part of a new service, the Space Force. And there's a lot of comparisons in the Space Force and the space domain to other domains. And I think some of those are actually healthy comparisons, and there certainly are great points of departure from which to consider. You know, you think of norms and behavior, you know, maybe the maritime domain comes in mind. So what examples can we use from the past? You know, I think of the Cold War Incidents at Sea Agreement between the US and USSR, or most recently, the 2014 Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea. You know, these are some examples of where we've established, or at least written down the norms. Our adversaries and competitors may break them, but we at least understand when they do cross the line, that they've crossed a line that we've established and we've agreed to. So I think this is a challenge for all of us. I think this is a great first step. And I know conferences like this allow many of you to think through some of these problems from a legal perspective. And I know that subsequent conversations are going to be on the legal parameters in space, but also as we start, there's something to think about as we grow new rules, if you will, and new norms in space. So with that, I want to hand it back over to Robert for his thoughts on some of these topics.
Thank you, sir. I really do appreciate working with General Endicott. I've really learned a lot from him. It's really incredible what he's been doing thus far, and how he's advancing space operations, not only for DoD, but beyond. For the remainder of the time that I have, I wanted to talk a little bit about governance and the rule of law in space. And I'm going to admit up front that I consider myself a space law aficionado. I don't see myself as an expert. I know that some of you on the line have been doing space law for many, many years. So part of what I'm going to discuss is kind of, as I've worked here at the NSC and previous jobs I've had, how I've come across some issues and some reflections that I've developed. So first, starting back in 2014, 2015, I had an opportunity to participate in the space seminar at the Eisenhower School at NDU. And as part of that seminar, we visited various elements of the private sector, from SpaceX, Lockheed Martin, Orbital Sciences, and Virgin Galactic. We also met with government and non-government entities from France and Germany, as well as a number of governmental agencies within the United States, whether it was NASA, the NSC, or space components of the Air Force. At the time, it was before Space Command was stood up. As part of our kind of final project, we had to come up with a paper to OSD policy, making recommendations over what we had observed in the space industry at large, and see if we had any recommendations. So as a group, and I was the only lawyer on the group, we had about 20 different recommendations. But the top number one recommendation, which wasn't even one that I advanced, was the thought that we needed to advance and modernize the legal regime in space. So the recommendation was made in 2015, and it was seen as one of the most critical requirements necessary to preserve and assure future space activities in orbits around the planet. Activities that facilitate all of those civil and national security needs we have: GPS, communications, radio, weather, intelligence gathering, military command and control, and most importantly, being able to watch your Netflix. And you may have discussed this already, but just to highlight, so in the public domain, it's been discussed that about 4 months ago, in mid-December 2020, the Russians conducted an anti-satellite test, attempting to destroy a defunct satellite in orbit. While they did not hit it, the attempt brought back fears of long-lasting debris resulting from the PRC's 2007 test that left significant long-lived and large amounts of debris for years and still in orbit to this date. So in deciding how to wrap my brain around the test from a legal perspective and understanding what a successfully executed test could leave, I started thinking through it, started talking to some subject matter experts across the US government, and then reading the Outer Space Treaty. So at first, under Article 9 of the OST, the Outer Space Treaty, I found language that I thought was dispositive, because I thought, what they're doing is illegal. At least that was my initial thought. Specifically, it says, state parties to the treaty shall be guided by the principles of cooperation and mutual assistance, and shall conduct their activities in outer space with due regard to the corresponding interests of all others, as to avoid the harmful contamination and also adverse changes in the Earth's environment. So to me, debris of any kind sounded like harmful contamination at first. But as we looked at it more carefully, since no contact had been made during the test and long-lived and large amounts of debris were not generated, there was virtual consensus that the attempted test alone could not be characterized as harmful contamination, and therefore could not be characterized as unlawful or illegal, especially before we knew whether it would be done in such a way as to leave behind large amounts of long-lived debris. So what could we say? Well, one thing I think is definitely fair to say is that it was certainly clearly irresponsible. If done poorly, it could create liability for the state that authorized the activity. And if they did not consult prior to conducting the test, it could also be considered a violation of the OST, since consultation is a requirement. So my sense in dealing with this issue is that there's really a strong preference to focus on non-legally binding norms for three reasons. First, because it's a good starting point and it's easier to achieve consensus. That's important. Consensus is not always hard and not always easy to do. Second, we can adapt more quickly, to changing circumstances. And third, it allows civil and commercial operators to have more of a voice in developing norms. So given this preference for non-binding norms, where do we go from here? Think about short-term goals, but also long-term goals. Do we sit down and work on a 2022 version of our outer space treaty that updates current issues given the scope and activity in space? Do we focus instead on validation through the state practices of those non-binding UN norms and guidelines for the long-term sustainability of outer space? Or do we look at other options in this environment of great power competition, where arguably distrust, deception, and secrecy are really the true norms? So to help think through these issues, I'd ask you to look at Russia, one of our closest competitors in this realm. So at times, we've actually had positive, cooperative relationships with the Russians in space. In fact, for many years, it's one of the few areas where there was positive engagements. And very recently, they approved to continue space collaboration with the United States until the year 2030. But unfortunately, sometimes those space relationships are leveraged or married with topics like disarmament, non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, and other strategic concerns when we're trying to discuss space bilateral policy. So I'll just give you some examples as they're all in the public domain. First, Open Skies Treaty, the other OST. The United States withdrew from Open Skies Treaty in November of last year because candidly, we didn't need it, right? The treaty was advanced under President Eisenhower during the beginning of the Cold War to assure transparency between NATO countries and the Soviet Union so that we could allow overflight and national airspaces over each other's countries so that we could see what the other was doing, right? The Open Skies Treaty allowed these flights, and for many reasons, including some diplomatic, they were certainly beneficial at the time. Russia wants the United States to rejoin the Open Skies Treaty, but I would invite you to look in open source. There's an article on the Defense News that really looks at it from a different perspective and really offers the opinion that it would send the wrong message for the United States to rejoin the Open Skies Treaty. Then there's the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty that prohibited missiles with nuclear warheads with a range of 500 to 5,000 miles and whose goals have not been materialized. The topic of disarmament in space, as you've probably already discussed and will continue to discuss probably throughout this conference, is always at the forefront, with Russia making public statements of an interest in slowing down the space arms race, yet behaving inconsistent with those statements. As it relates to the space arms race, defining the problem, trusting each other, and engaging in honest dialogue is extremely challenging and will remain challenging. On a positive note, the United States and Russia did sign a 5-year extension of the New START Treaty, which was to expire in February. The treaty seeks to reduce the number of intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and nuclear warheads each country has. Russia was very happy to sign the treaty, but whether they will act in accordance of it remains to be seen. So this is part of the geopolitical backdrop with only one of our main competitors. Haven't discussed China yet. And it's important that we think through this as we contemplate what the short and long-term options should be going forward. So to wrap up my portion of the discussion, then open it up to any questions that you may have. I want to leave you with some questions. Some that I really don't have answers for, but I just thought they'd be important to continue to think through. First, given current great power competition, is a modernized version of the Outer Space Treaty advisable or realistic now? Second, is relying on norms the best manner forward in building legal governance in space? Definitely some strong reasons for why we should. So if a treaty or binding norms or non-binding norms, well, they are on the table, and understanding they may be a little bit like fiction these days, what will it take? And by that, I mean, just think about what I just discussed in the context of Russia. What geopolitically has to change for those movements forward in the law to happen? As lower and mid-altitude orbits become more congested and smaller countries start to engage in their own space presence, how do we ensure responsible behavior? Do we have the right carrots, positive reinforcement, or the right sticks, enforcement actions or options to support the development of international legal standards of conduct? I think I'll stop there and see if you have any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, sirs. That was fantastic. There are a number of questions in the Q&A box. I will do my best to go through some of those. And the first we have is from Captain Michael Sinclair. And I think we could pose this to both of you. The NSC has generated a lot of policy. You both mentioned there's been a lot of momentum lately. Could you briefly touch on some policies that you were most proud to be a part of?
Wow, I think we both can answer that. Mike, great seeing you. I see you on there on the Q&A, and I think that's great. And it's another reminder that we had some amazing, smart, hardworking, and hardworking space experts working these tough problems over the last couple of years. So thanks to Mike, everything that he's done as well. I get this question, I've received this question multiple times now, is coming towards the end of my tour. And I'm gonna answer it a little differently. I think all the policies are significant. I think when you look at all the comprehensive work that's been done, this is an example of a community, and it continues to be worked, an example of communities that are thinking hard about a very hard domain, but a very exciting domain. We see such great promise and opportunity in space, and so we're trying to enable that with our policies. And I really do think that it's a compendium of enabling policies, and even the statements that we're making recently, it continues to be that, with a clear reality, of course, of the challenges and risks and of that domain as well. I think what I'm most proud of, though, is I don't think in any time in my professional career has there been more combined focus and cooperation from the highest level across the interagency and across the board with a group of people that truly see the opportunity that space provides for our nation. I think when they write the history books, they're going to have some great chapters, the beginning of a new service, the Space Force, the reestablishment of U.S. Space Command, the momentum that we've generated and built that will truly get us back to the moon, but with a different paradigm of which will have a sustained presence on the moon. And then, of course, ultimately making our way to Mars as we explore the solar system and in ways that we have just never before. And I think the history books are going to capture all that. But what made that happen is many people on this net. I would love to see all 287 participants, probably recognize many. And the work that everybody has put into this has made our nation better for it, and has truly helped make our nation lead. And so it's an important time to be the nation that leads. It leads in these discussions, leads in the norms. It leads in the discussions on the safety, sustainability, security of space, because we have a vision that we believe is worth exporting, if you will, and sharing with our friends and allies. So that's what I'm most proud about, is just the actual teamwork that I've seen, commitment, very low amounts of strife, because everybody seems to have been, focused on the end prize, which is making this better for our nation. So thank you for that question. And again, Mike, thank you for what you've done and what you did here in the NSC as well.
I would only add, not much I could add to that other than to say that it's been really an incredible opportunity as a lawyer to be able to support all those changes at a really historic time. And it's been a true honor to work next to General Endicott as things like SpaceCom, Space Force, and a lot of the new initiatives that we're working through with other countries are moving forward. Good to see you, Mike.
Oh, great, thank you, sirs. There are a number of questions on norms, and I think I can try and capture a few of these with rephrasing it a bit. Given the non-binding nature of norms, could you speak at all to past state practice with regard to some of what's being advocated? Understanding the OST principles are generally somewhat broad, if not very broad. Looking at state practice since the Sputnik launch, do you see that impacting some of the efforts with regard to advocating for responsible behavior in space? I think there was a great example in here with regard to the Article 9 due regard consultation provision in some previous ASAT tests. The fact that may not have been invoked in the past, is that at all a hindrance with this overall effort?
I'll kick it off. I think I know what you're getting at. We're trying to figure out how to answer that question, because you make a great point. Activities happen in space, and there's responses to those activities. Short of having legally binding laws, certainly, and really well-established norms, every specific act that we deal with is setting maybe some sort of precedent. And I understand that. And that's really I think the sensitivity of what's happening right now in space. It's not lost on us that I don't know if we set precedent with every activity, and I'd look to the legal regime to tell me what exactly precedent is set. But from a policy perspective, I know that the world is watching. The world watches how the United States responds. The world watches how the international community responds. And I will tell you from a policy perspective, that weighs heavy in our thinking, because we also recognize the opportunity to establish, not to use a legal term, but rules of the road, right? And that's exactly what we have. My challenge to you and to those who are on this conference is, how do we establish norms, rules, laws, and think truly through the second, third, fourth, fifth order effects? How do we create conditions that will be suitable for us in a domain that we truly are at the beginning, if you will, of really understanding the domain and exploiting in a positive way that domain? And so that's a great question. That's a great question to us, and that's my question back to you. And so, Robert, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I'd really say that over the last 6 to 9 months, I spent a lot of time wrestling and thinking through this, and I think I would separate it into short-term goals and long-term goals. And the geopolitical situation I described with Russia, I brought it up for a reason, right? We live in a complex world where folks are designing and developing new capabilities, new weapons behind the scenes. We know that each other is doing it, and there's a fundamental distrust. So in the short term, I think the best we can do is to have guidelines like the UN guidelines and develop norms through our state practice about what looks like responsible behavior. But I saw a question in there, like in terms of new binding laws and treaties going forward. I think that conceptually, 20, 30 years down the road, if you had the right geopolitical situation, we would want something that sounds like an international legal standard that everybody has to abide by. But we're not there, and we're not going to get there anytime soon, because for one, and this is something where the similarities I think in cyberspace is that we just don't trust that Russia or China is going to abide by anything that we would agree to, and it's going to only work to our disadvantage, right? So why would we enter into agreements that the one country that does really care about the rule of law is going to handcuff themselves through, right? Just kind of me reflecting. So instead, we start with norms, and I think that state practice will slowly evolve, kind of like it did in the maritime world. I think there are really good corollaries there to the maritime world. And eventually, maybe it's 40, 50 years down the road, we end up with something that we can really sink our teeth in. But I think it's going to have to evolve. And I think where the commercial sector and the civil sector are also key participants, they may be leading the way, right? The government used to lead it up until very recently. Now it's more divided, and who knows in the future what that's going to look like. So I think there's a lot of complex problems going forward, and it's a great time to be working on it.
I think often of satellite servicing, just this technology coming into play, satellite servicing, satellite debris removal, these potential commercial activities are coming online, and how do we create norms and rules that'll apply for them and enable, frankly, these activities that do make space more safe and sustainable, and then of course grows a market of which that our economy can thrive in as well. And so we have to be very careful what we put in place. I'm not a sailor, and I'm not a Navy expert, so this is going to sound embarrassing, but I got to imagine the first tugboat that showed up into a harbor and started pulling ships around caused some consternation. We don't have a memory on what those activities look like at the beginning, but when you think about what we're looking at in space, we really do have a 21st century equivalent of that happening. And so how do we create the rules of the road that allow that to happen safely and sustainably? And then of course, managing the risks, right? You got to be clear-eyed on the risks and the national security risks as well.
Well, thank you again. We've got one from Colonel Chuck Killian commenting on the reliance on commercial space, and perhaps you could speak to some impacts that may have, and any thoughts you may have moving forward, given that there's the reliance with regard to the commercial sector.
Yeah, this is my opinion. By the way, Chuck, great hearing from you. It's great to not see you, but hear from you on the net. And thank you for that question. I don't know exactly now where we are on reliance on commercial, maybe for space launch, of course, and activities like that. But when you think of national security activities, I don't think we're there yet, other than potentially access. But we have, as we go forward, as our commercial enterprise becomes far more robust than it's ever been, we do, as national security practitioners, have to understand on what those limits are, right? What makes something marketable may not make something the most useful and give us the greatest utility on the national security front. So then we have to look at, are there still things that the government must invest in that the commercial enterprise won't, right? And so we have to ask ourselves those questions. But also, I think when we have the problem set, securing the domain, there's just many examples now where we see the commercial enterprise filling in the gaps. And I think that's really the focus right now, is what we're learning in the fast exploding commercial market in space. What can we use to apply for rapid development, quick development, and more resilient capabilities in national security space? I don't know how we got to a point. It's not too categorical, but you know, how do we get to the point where every billionaire in America seemingly has a space program? It's an exciting time, but you know, each one of those companies has a vision for our nation's future and the market's future in space. I think that we're going to have, and we have many examples of using those, their opportunities for national security opportunities, right? To leverage those capabilities and also leverage on their capabilities for our civil space activities as you're following on the NASA front as well. And the different contracts that are being let for our Artemis program. And so I think that's the best way to look at it now, is what opportunities can be gained from them, but then certainly understand the limits of those opportunities.
Well, thank you, sir. I think from the number of questions in the Q&A box, obviously a lot of folks enjoyed your presentation, but I do understand you've got a commitment at the top of the hour. And so at this point, if you have any closing comments, I can turn that over to you, but we are tracking that you have a commitment at the top of the hour there.
Yeah, I got to get to the sit room.
We're almost done.
So even in the White House, people knock on the door and say, hey, you got to get out of that room. So that's exactly what that just happened. So Robert, do you have any final, and I'll close?
No, I want to thank Space Command for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. Like I started off by saying, you know, working here has been an incredible opportunity. I don't have enough chance these days to talk to judge advocates, but if any of you have any questions going forward about the NSC or the practice here, I'd be happy to talk to anyone. I think Mark can give anyone my email information, and happy to talk to you. Best of luck. Thank you.
Yeah, and Mark, thank you for this opportunity. Thank you all for this opportunity for us to be able to talk to you on this seminal conference. I think it's a smashing success already from what I've seen and what I've heard. I also just want to thank you all for what you're doing at this unique time in history. It's a fascinating time to be working in space. The expertise in this room, seeing the names popping up on the side, you know, each and every one of you is contributing to something pretty magnificent. It's something that you'll be proud of. You'll tell your kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews, and you'll be proud of for a long time. And so with that, I just want to say thanks for being part of this team. We have your back. We are rooting for you, and we absolutely want to work together as we address the challenges in space, but also just take advantage of such great opportunities that we've never seen before. And so with that, thank you very much. Thank you for this time to talk to you, and Godspeed to all of you.
Thank you, sirs. Appreciate it.
Thank you.